There is an old idea, quiet and almost easy to miss, that the surest mark of a wise guide is how little they need to be seen at all. We tend to believe that influence requires visibility, that to matter we must be noticed, credited, in command of every detail. Lao Tzu, written Lao Tzu, taught something gentler. The best leader, he said, is one whose people barely know they are being led, because nothing is forced and no credit is claimed. You do not need to know anything about Taoism to be here tonight. You only need to know the exhaustion of feeling you must control everyone and everything around you to matter. The household that falls apart unless you manage it, the team at work that seems unable to move without your direct hand, the quiet belief that if you are not visibly in charge, you are not really leading at all. That feeling is enough. That feeling is the whole doorway in. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is, where you are listening from, and whether you are a front, back, or side sleeper. There are no wrong answers here, only fellow travelers finding their way to rest. Tonight we will move through 13 short chapters, each one looking at this same quiet teaching from a different angle. A general who shouts every order, a chef who cannot leave her kitchen, a captain who will not let go of the helm, a beekeeper who keeps disturbing the very hive she means to protect. Old stories, simple voices, the same gentle question turning slowly in the dark. So wherever you are right now, let yourself settle in. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Nothing here asks you to lead, manage, or hold anything together tonight. You are simply allowed to listen and to rest. Thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night. Let us begin. In the heart of the savannah, the lions reign supreme, their presence a testament to the untamed beauty of the wild. Worst is feared, the next is hated, the next is loved and praised, but the best, Lao Tzu wrote, is the one whose people are barely aware that he exists at all. When his work is done and his task complete, the people say, "We did this ourselves." This is not a riddle about being invisible for its own sake. It is a teaching about where the credit and the noise ought to land. A leader who needs to be seen is, in some quiet way, still leading for himself. A leader whose people forget to thank him has done something rarer. He has helped them discover their own capability rather than reminding them constantly of his. We tend to measure leadership by how loudly it announces itself. Lao Tzu measured it by how completely it could disappear into the outcome. The best guidance leaves no fingerprints, only results that feel, to everyone involved, entirely their own. There was once a general named Hezro who commanded the garrison of a border town and who believed with total conviction that an army was only as strong as the volume of its commander's voice. He shouted every order himself. He stood at the center of every drill, calling out each movement of spear and shield, correcting soldiers mid-stride, repeating commands they had already heard 100 times before. When his officers tried to relay instructions on his behalf, he would override them loudly in front of the ranks, as if to remind everyone exactly whose authority was in motion. His soldiers were not untrained. Many had served for years. But under Hezro's command, they had stopped thinking for themselves entirely, because thinking for themselves had never once been rewarded. They waited for his voice before they moved, even when the movement was obvious, even when waiting cost them precious seconds in drills that, in a real battle, would have cost lives. An old soldier, retired from service years before, came through the garrison one autumn to visit his grandson, who served under Hezro. He watched a single drill from the wall above the training yard, and what he saw troubled him more than any battlefield he had survived. Afterward, he found Hezro resting near the armory, sweat-soaked from shouting an entire afternoon's worth of orders that any competent officer could have given. The old soldier studied him for a long moment, then asked gently, "How many of your men can move a spear line without your voice telling them where to stand?" Hezro looked offended. "None. That is why I am here. That is my command. And if you fall ill tomorrow, then my lieutenants will relay my orders exactly as I would give them." "But they will still be relaying your orders," the old soldier said, "not making their own. What happens the day you are not there to be relayed at all? The day the message cannot reach you in time because the enemy has already closed the gap?" Hezro had no answer ready. He sat with the question longer than he wanted to, turning a leather strap over in his hands. "I have always believed," he said slowly, "that a strong commander is one whose orders are followed instantly and without question." "That is true," the old soldier agreed, "but you have confused two different things. An order followed instantly is good. An order that must be given for absolutely everything, down to the smallest movement of a soldier's foot, is not strength. It is a kind of weakness wearing strength's uniform. You have trained your men beautifully to obey you. You have trained them very poorly to think." "Then what should I have done instead?" The old soldier considered this. "When I commanded my own company years ago, I gave fewer orders every season, not more. I taught my officers the reasoning behind each command, not just the command itself, so that when the moment came and I was not there, wounded or simply too far down the line to be heard, they could reach the same conclusion I would have reached, on their own, without waiting for my voice to arrive." "And did it work?" "It worked the day I took an arrow in the shoulder during a river crossing," the old soldier said quietly. "My second in command did not wait for me. He had heard me reason through a dozen crossings before. He knew what I would have ordered, because he had learned to think the way I thought, not merely to wait for what I would say. We held the crossing. I do not believe we would have held it if every man on that riverbank had been listening for my voice instead of using his own judgment." "And were you not afraid in that moment that he would choose wrongly?" Hezro asked. "I was afraid every day I commanded," the old soldier said. "Fear does not vanish simply because you have trained your officers well. It only becomes a fear you can live beside, rather than one that demands your voice be heard in every corner of the field before you can rest." Hezro thought of his own soldiers, standing motionless in formation, waiting for him to tell them what their own eyes could already see needed doing. "I thought silence in the ranks meant discipline," he admitted. "Sometimes it does," the old soldier said. And sometimes it means you have taught 100 capable men to need you for things they were always capable of deciding themselves. A garrison that falls apart the moment its commander is absent was never truly strong. It was only ever borrowing its commander's strength season after season, never building any of its own. Hezro changed little that week, and less the week after. Old habits rarely yield to a single conversation. But he began slowly to let one officer run a single drill without his voice interrupting it. He stood at the edge of the yard instead of the center, watching rather than commanding, and noticed with some discomfort how much the soldiers improved the moment they were trusted to decide something for themselves. It was not an easy season for him. Twice he caught himself striding forward to correct a formation that, left a moment longer, corrected itself without him. Once he stopped an officer mid-command, only to realize the order being given was sound, and that his interruption had cost the man a measure of standing in front of his own soldiers for nothing. He apologized that evening, awkwardly, the words unfamiliar in his mouth. The officer seemed almost more unsettled by the apology than he had been by the interruption itself. By the season's end, Hezro had stopped giving orders during the morning drills entirely, choosing instead to watch from the yard's edge with his arms folded, saying nothing unless a genuine danger arose. The drills grew sharper, not looser, the soldiers moving with a confidence that had not been there when every motion waited on his voice. He never became a quiet commander, but he began to understand, faintly, that a garrison's strength might one day be measured not by how loudly he could be heard across it, but by how well it might hold the line on a day he could not be heard at all. In Sufi poetry, there is a similar understanding of leadership that asks nothing to be loud in order to be true. The poet Rumi often wrote of the reed flute, hollowed out and emptied of itself, which makes its most beautiful sound only because it has been cleared of everything that would otherwise muffle the breath passing through it. A guide in this tradition is sometimes spoken of the same way, not as a voice shouting instruction from the front, but as a hollow vessel through which something larger moves, asking for no credit, claiming no ownership of the music. There are two threads worth holding on to here. The first is that emptiness in Sufi thought is not failure or absence. It is what allows transmission to happen cleanly, without the guide's own ego distorting the message along the way. The second is that the dervish, turning in slow circles during the sacred dance known as the Sema, surrenders visible control entirely, trusting the movement to carry meaning that no spoken command could deliver as faithfully. Hezro's soldiers, frozen without his shouted instruction, were the opposite of the hollow reed. They were full of waiting, full of dependence, with no space left for their own breath to move through. The Sufi poets would say the general's voice, however well-intentioned, had become an obstruction rather than a channel. True guidance in this telling is the breath that passes through cleanly, because the vessel has learned gradually to empty itself of the need to be heard at all. You may recognize something of Hezro in your own life, even if you have never commanded a garrison. Perhaps it shows up at home, where you cannot leave the kitchen on a holiday morning because you are certain no one else will season the meal correctly, calling out corrections from across the room, even as someone else's hands are already capable. Perhaps it shows up at work, In a team meeting where you find yourself repeating an instruction a colleague has already understood, simply because silence from you feels somehow like losing your grip on the outcome. Notice, if you can, how tiring this is. Not the work itself, but the constant narration of the work, the sense that nothing may proceed unless your voice is the one directing it. Notice what it might feel like to let one small task move forward tonight without your correction, your oversight, your name attached to its completion. Not because the task does not matter to you, but because your hand does not have to be the only one capable of holding it. There is no need to solve this tonight, and certainly no need to decide it right now. Simply feel for a moment what it might be like to set the instruction down. The way a tired commander might finally stop shouting across a quiet yard and discover the soldiers were already moving in the right direction on their own. Let that small release be the thing that carries you gently towards sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching woven through the Dajing about water and the lowest place. Water seeks the ground others avoid, the low valley, the hollow basin, the place beneath everything else, and yet by settling there, it comes to govern the whole landscape around it. Rivers carve canyons not by forcing their way through stone, but by remaining patient in the low place long enough for the stone to yield on its own. Lao Tzu called this the nature of true authority. It does not rise above others to be seen. It circles below them, and from there quietly shapes everything that flows past. This runs against nearly everything we are taught about leading. We imagine the leader at the summit, visible from every direction, commanding the view. But the valley commands the river. The low place gathers what the high place can only watch pass by. A leader who insists on the highest position is often the one furthest from where the real shaping work occurs, down where the people actually live, struggle, and decide, each day whether to trust the one who claims to guide them. There was once a headman of a small farming village who signed his name to every decision made within its boundaries, no matter how small. He signed the order for new grain stores. He signed the permission for a footbridge repair. He signed his name beneath the schedule for the communal well, even though the schedule had not changed in 11 years. His name, carved or inked onto every document the village produced, had become, in his mind, the proof of his leadership. Without his signature, nothing in the village felt official. Without his presence at every gathering, no decision felt complete, even when the matter at hand barely concerned him. The villagers respected him, mostly, though a quiet weariness had settled over many of their interactions with him. Every small request required a visit to his house. Every minor dispute waited, sometimes for days, until he was available to weigh in and append his name to whatever resolution emerged. An elder from a neighboring valley, known for tending a respected council of her own people, came through the village one spring to trade seed grain. She watched the headman spend an entire morning signing his name to a list of which families would draw water on which days, a rotation the villagers themselves had already agreed upon among themselves, peacefully, the evening before. "Forgive my curiosity," the elder said, once the signing was finished, "but did the families need your name on that schedule, or did they only need the schedule itself?" The headman straightened with some pride. "They need my name. It is what makes the arrangement official. Without it, who would the council answer to if a dispute arose?" "And did a dispute arise?" "No," the headman admitted. "They agreed on it themselves quite easily, before I arrived." "Then tell me," the elder said, not unkindly, "what work did your name actually do this morning, beyond occupying an hour that might have been spent elsewhere?" The headman considered this with some discomfort. "I suppose it confirmed what they had already decided. A confirmation can be valuable," the elder said, "but I noticed something else while I watched. 3 different villagers came to your door this morning before you had even finished your tea, each waiting for your signature on matters they had clearly already resolved among themselves. Do you know what that tells me?" "Perhaps," the elder said. "Or perhaps it tells me they have learned that nothing is allowed to be finished here until you have touched it, not because they need your wisdom, but because they have been taught season after season that their own resolution is not enough on its own." The headman frowned. "I only wanted to make sure everything was handled correctly." "I do not doubt your intention," the elder said. "Intentions are rarely the problem. It is the habit built on top of a good intention that quietly outgrows it until the habit itself becomes the thing your villagers are responding to, rather than any actual need for your judgment. I believe you wanted things handled correctly, but consider the river that runs past your fields. It does not sign its name to the fish that swim in it, nor to the fields it waters, nor to the mill it turns. It simply settles into the lowest ground available, season after season, and everything around it arranges itself according to that quiet, constant presence. No one waits for the river's permission to plant. They simply trust that it will be there, low and steady, doing its work without announcement. You are saying, I should be more like the river. I am saying the river governs more of this valley than you do, and it has never once signed anything, the elder said, smiling now. Your villagers already know how to divide water fairly among themselves. They proved it this morning before you were even dressed. What they may not know, because you have never given them the chance to discover it, is that their own agreement is already enough. It does not require your name to become real. The headman sat with this through the rest of the elder's visit, saying little, watching his own village with new and slightly uncomfortable attention. That week, when 2 families came to settle a small dispute over a shared fence line, he found himself, for the first time in years, simply listening rather than ruling, asking questions rather than supplying answers. And when the 2 families reached an agreement on their own, he said nothing more than that it sounded fair and did not reach for his ink. It did not become official that day in the old way, but something in the village shifted, quietly, in the months that followed. Fewer visits to his door for matters that had never truly needed him, more decisions reached and held among neighbors without waiting for a signature to make them real. The headman noticed, with a strange mixture of relief and humility, that the village had not grown less orderly without his name on everything. If anything, it had grown more capable of ordering itself, the way a valley does not need to be told by anyone that the river belongs there. A year later, a younger man from a neighboring district visited, hoping to learn how the headman kept such a famously well-run village with so few formal records. The headman laughed at this, gently, and showed him an inkpot that had gone nearly dry from disuse. "I used to think order meant my hand on every page," he said. "Now I think it mostly means staying quiet long enough to notice that my neighbors already know how to live beside one another." The visitor left unconvinced, certain there must be some hidden system he had failed to see. There was no hidden system. There was only a man who had finally stopped reaching for his ink before anyone had even asked him to. In Lakota tradition, there is a similar understanding of leadership rooted in humility rather than command. Among many Plains nations, a chief was not someone who issued orders to be obeyed, but someone the people chose to follow because of demonstrated wisdom, generosity, and restraint. And that following could be withdrawn just as freely if the chief began to act for his own glory rather than the good of the people. There are two threads worth holding here. The first is the practice, among some Lakota leaders, of giving away possessions rather than accumulating them, understanding that true standing came from what one gave to the community, not what one collected or claimed credit for. A leader who hoarded recognition the way the headman hoarded his signature would have been seen in this tradition as someone mistaking ownership for leadership. The second is the council's circle itself, where elders spoke and listened in turn, with no single voice positioned as more important than the others, authority distributed rather than concentrated, much like the elder's quiet river that governs without ever needing to be seated above the valley it shapes. The headman's signature, the Lakota teaching would suggest, was never really proof of his leadership at all. It was only proof of his need to be included in something that had already, quietly, learned to function without him. Think of the family gathering you have organized for years, the one where every dish, every seating arrangement, every small decision passes through your hands before it feels settled to you. Think of the work project where you find yourself reviewing a colleague's completed task simply to add your own mark to it, even when the work was already sound. There is a particular tiredness in needing your name, your stamp, your presence attached to every outcome before it feels real. Notice what it costs you to carry that weight night after night. The hours spent confirming what others had already confirmed. The quiet anxiety that something might slip through undone if you are not the one to seal it. And notice, too, what it might feel like to trust, just once, that an agreement reached without you in the room could still hold. That a decision made by people who care about the outcome might not require your signature to become real. You do not have to decide anything tonight. Simply feel the lowest, quietest place in yourself. The place that does not need to be seen at the summit of every conversation. And let that place settle, the way water settles into a valley floor, asking nothing, claiming nothing, simply present and steady as the night moves over you towards sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a Taoist image of governing a great nation as one would handle cooking a very small fish with the lightest possible touch, because too much prodding tears the flesh apart before it ever reaches the plate. Lao Tzu used this image to warn against the leader who cannot stop intervening, who turns every small matter over and over out of anxious diligence, mistaking constant adjustment for careful stewardship. A small fish cooked well is left largely alone, given just enough heat, just enough time, and trusted to finish on its own. A small fish handled too much falls apart in the pan, ruined by the very attention meant to perfect it. The same is true of a household, a team, a community. Too many corrections, too much checking, too much turning things over to inspect them, and what should have come together whole instead comes apart in pieces, undone by the leader's own restless hand. Sometimes the most skillful thing a leader can do is nothing further at all, and trust the dish to finish cooking on its own heat. There was once a head chef named Austin who ran the kitchen of a wealthy merchant's house, and who could not bring himself to leave that kitchen to anyone else, not even for an afternoon. He had trained 4 capable cooks beneath him over the years, each skilled enough to run a kitchen of their own, and yet none of them were permitted to finish a single dish without Austin standing over the pan, adjusting the heat, tasting the broth a 3rd and 4th time, moving a spoon they had already placed correctly. His cooks had grown quietly resentful, though none dared say so. They had learned to wait for his hovering presence before plating anything, since dishes plated without his final approval were sometimes sent back to the kitchen regardless of how they tasted, simply because Austin had not personally confirmed them. He worked from before dawn until well past midnight most days, exhausted, snapping at apprentices who moved too slowly under his watch, certain that the moment he stepped away, the kitchen would collapse into ruin. One evening, an old woman who had once cooked for the merchant's father, long retired and rarely seen in the kitchens anymore, came by to deliver a basket of herbs from her garden. She found Austin hovering over a pot of fish stew, stirring it for the 5th time in as many minutes, muttering about the seasoning, though the dish had been seasoned correctly twice already. "You stir that pot the way a worried mother rocks a sleeping child," the old woman said, setting down her basket. "Gently, but far too often." Austin barely looked up. "If I do not watch it, it will burn or curdle or fall apart entirely." "Has it ever done any of those things on its own without your stirring?" "I would not know," Austin admitted. "I have never let it sit long enough to find out." The old woman pulled up a stool and sat, watching him stir a 6th time. "May I tell you something I learned cooking for this family's grandfather many years before you arrived?" "If you wish. The fish you are cooking is delicate. Too much heat tears it. Too much stirring breaks it into pieces before it ever reaches a plate. The finest fish stews I ever made were the ones I touched the least, enough to start them properly, and then enough trust to let the heat finish what I had begun." Austin stopped stirring, though his hand still hovered near the spoon. "But if I step away and it goes wrong, the fault is mine. I would rather be there, correcting it, than absent and blamed for what happened without me." "Has standing over it constantly ever once prevented something from going wrong?" the old woman asked. Or has it only ever made you feel in the moment as though you were preventing something? Ostan considered this honestly, and found he could not name a single instance where his hovering had caught a genuine problem before it would have surfaced regardless. And if you stand over it every moment, correcting what does not need correcting, do you know what you risk instead? What? You risk the very thing you fear, the old woman said. Not because the dish was left alone too long, but because it was handled too much. A fish falls apart from too many hands turning it, far more often than it spoils from too little attention. The danger you are trying to prevent by hovering is often the danger your hovering creates. Ostan looked down at the stew, the fish already beginning to flake apart from the repeated stirring, exactly as the old woman had described. He set the spoon down slowly. I have been so afraid of ruining it that I have been ruining it myself. Most cooks learn that eventually, the old woman said, not unkindly. Some learn it from a wasted pot of stew. Others learn it from watching their kitchen staff grow tired and resentful, waiting endlessly for a final word that was never truly necessary in the first place. You have 4 trained cooks in this kitchen who have not been allowed to finish a single dish on their own judgment in years. Do you know what that costs you beyond the exhaustion you carry every night? Tell me. It costs you a kitchen that can only function when you are standing in it, she said. A kitchen that falls apart the day you are too tired or too ill or simply too human to be everywhere at once. The merchant's grandfather understood this. He trusted his cooks enough to leave the kitchen entirely some evenings, and the food that came out on those nights was no worse for his absence. Often it was better because the cooks finally had room to trust their own hands instead of waiting for his. Austin said little more that evening, but the next morning, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he assigned the fish stew to his most senior cook and walked out of the kitchen entirely, finding small tasks elsewhere in the house to occupy the hour. He returned to find the stew finished, the fish whole and tender, seasoned exactly as it should have been, perhaps even slightly better than his own anxious hand might have managed. He said nothing about it at first, simply tasted it in silence, and the cook watched him carefully, bracing for correction that never came. In the weeks that followed, he stepped away more often than he stayed, and discovered, slowly, that his kitchen had not needed him standing over every pan nearly as much as he had needed to believe it did. The merchant himself noticed the change before Austin mentioned it to anyone. The food had not declined, and Austin, for the first time in years, looked rested rather than harried when guests arrived for the evening meal. When the merchant asked what had changed, Austin considered the question carefully before answering. I learned that a kitchen is not made strong by one tired pair of hands refusing to rest, he said. It is made strong by 4 trained cooks finally being trusted to use what they already know. In Stoic philosophy, there is a similar understanding regarding the limits of control and the wisdom of restraint. Epictetus taught that peace comes from distinguishing clearly between what is within our power and what is not, and that much suffering arises precisely from trying to control what was never ours to control in the first place. A leader who hovers over every dish, every decision, every small action of those beneath him is, in Stoic terms, mistaking the actions of others for his own domain, when in truth his only true jurisdiction was ever his own judgment and effort. There are 2 threads worth holding here. The first is the Stoic concept of the dichotomy of control, recognizing that once a task has been properly delegated, its outcome belongs partly to forces beyond the original actor's grip, and peace comes from releasing what cannot be gripped tighter regardless of effort. The second is Marcus Aurelius's repeated counsel to govern by example rather than by constant intervention, trusting that disciplined character, demonstrated quietly and consistently, shapes others more powerfully than any number of direct corrections ever could. Ostan's hovering, the Stoics would say, was never really about the fish stew at all. It was about his own discomfort with releasing what was, in truth, never fully his to hold on to in the first place. Perhaps you recognize this in the way you manage a group project at work, checking and rechecking a colleague's draft long after it has already met every requirement, unable to simply let the work stand on its own. Perhaps it shows up in your own household routines, washing dishes someone else has already cleaned, refolding laundry a partner has already folded correctly, because some part of you cannot trust the task to be finished unless your own hands have touched it last. Notice how much energy this costs you, night after night. Not the original task, but the endless rechecking layered on top of it, the quiet conviction that nothing is truly done until you yourself have confirmed it. Notice, too, what it might feel like to let one small thing finish tonight without your final pass over it. To trust that the stew, left alone at the right moment, might come out whole. You do not need to resolve this now. Simply feel what it would be like to set the spoon down just once and let something else finish cooking on its own gentle heat, the same heat that is, even now, helping your own body settle slowly toward rest. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Te Ching describes a kind of leader who acts without acting, a principle often rendered as wu wei, or effortless action. This does not mean doing nothing. It means acting in harmony with what is already moving, rather than forcing events against their natural direction. A farmer practicing wu wei does not yell at the crops to grow faster. He prepares the soil, plants at the right season, and trusts the unseen processes already at work beneath the surface. A leader practicing the same principle does not force outcomes through sheer will and visible exertion. He arranges conditions wisely and then steps back, allowing the people, the team, the family to move according to their own competent momentum. We often equate leadership with effort. The more visible the strain, the more impressive the leadership appears. But Lao Tzu suggests the opposite measure. The leader who must visibly strain at every moment has likely arranged the conditions poorly from the start. The leader who arranges well need hardly be seen exerting effort at all. There was once a ship's captain named Dorian who had crossed the same trading route for over 20 years and who refused, under any circumstance, to surrender the helm to another hand, even to sleep. He believed that a captain who slept while his ship sailed was a captain inviting disaster, and so he stayed awake for days at a stretch, gripping the wheel through storm and calm alike, trusting no one else to hold the course steady in his place. His crew respected his skill, but watched with growing concern as exhaustion carved deeper lines into his face each season. His judgment, once sharp, had begun to slip in small ways, a misread current here, a delayed correction there, mistakes that a rested mind would never have made. One voyage, an old navigator joined the crew for a single trading season, a woman who had sailed these same waters decades before Dorian had ever taken his first command. She watched him grip the wheel through an entire night, despite calm seas and a clear sky, and the next morning found him swaying slightly on his feet, eyes red from days without rest. "You look," she said, "like a man fighting a storm that is not actually happening." Dorian rubbed his eyes. "The sea never truly rests. Neither can I, if I want this ship to reach its destination safely." "And yet," the navigator said, gesturing at the calm water stretching in every direction, "the sea appears to be resting quite peacefully this morning. Tell me, who is steering while you stand here talking to me?" Dorian glanced back toward the wheel, where his second mate held the course steady, exactly as instructed, the ship cutting a clean, even line through the gentle swell. "He is competent enough for calm water." "And in a storm?" "In a storm, I must be there myself." "Why?" The question caught him off guard. "Because the ship's life depends on the helm being held correctly. I cannot trust that to chance." "Is it chance?" the navigator asked, "or is it 3 seasons of training you delivered yourself, with your own hands and your own patience? Those are not the same thing at all, though fear tends to blur them together at 3 in the morning during a storm." "You are not trusting it to chance," the navigator said. "You trained that man yourself, did you not? You have sailed with him for 3 seasons. He has weathered storms beside you, learned your corrections, absorbed your judgment the way water absorbs the shape of whatever vessel holds it, and yet you treat every storm as though it requires your hands specifically, as if his hands, trained by yours, suddenly forget everything the moment the wind rises." Dorian said nothing for a long moment, watching the horizon. "What if you are wrong to never rest and exhaustion proves that instead?" the navigator asked. "I've sailed with captains who gripped the helm every storm of their careers, refusing to share the wheel even when their hands shook from fatigue. Most of them did not die in a storm they failed to survive. They died, or nearly did, from decisions made on the 40th hour without sleep, when their judgment had worn down to almost nothing, long after the storm itself had passed." "Then what would you have me do? Hand the wheel over and hope?" "Not hope," the navigator said. "Trust what you have already built. You did not hire that second mate by accident. You trained him precisely because you believed at some point that he could be trusted with exactly this. The question is not whether he is capable. The question is whether you are capable of believing your own training was good enough to let go of, even for a single storm." That night, as dark clouds gathered along the southern horizon and the wind began to rise, Dorian did something he had never once done in 20 years at sea. He briefed his second mate thoroughly, walked him through the coming conditions, and then went below to rest, leaving the helm in hands he had spent 3 seasons preparing for exactly this moment. He did not sleep easily. He lay awake listening to the creak of the hull, the shift of the wind, every sound amplified by years of habit telling him he should be at the wheel. But when he climbed back on deck before dawn, the storm had passed, the ship was on course, and his second mate stood steady at the helm, tired but proud, having weathered the night entirely on his own judgment. Dorian said little, but something in him had shifted permanently. In the seasons that followed, he still loved the wheel, still took it often and gladly. But he no longer believed that holding it every single hour was the same thing as keeping his ship safe. He had learned, slowly and at some cost to his own pride, that a well-trained hand at the helm could carry a ship through a storm just as surely as his own, and that his refusal to rest had never been protecting the ship so much as protecting his own need to feel irreplaceable. He began rotating the watch more deliberately after that voyage, teaching each mate not just the mechanics of the helm, but the reasoning behind every decision he made there, so that the knowledge itself, and not merely his presence, became something the ship could rely upon. Other captains in port noticed his crew's steadiness during difficult crossings, and asked him sometimes what training method had produced such capable hands. He told them more than once that the training had mattered less than his own willingness to finally walk away from the wheel long enough to find out it could hold without him. In Hindu philosophy, there is a similar understanding found in the teaching of nishkama karma, or action performed without attachment to its fruits, as described in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna counsels the warrior Arjuna to act fully and skillfully, yet without clinging to the outcome of that action as though it belonged to him personally. A captain gripping the helm through every storm, refusing all rest, is acting from attachment, believing the outcome depends entirely on his own continuous exertion, rather than trusting the larger order of skill, training, and circumstance already in motion around him. There are two threads worth holding here. The first is the teaching that excessive attachment to control distorts judgment, much as Dorian's exhaustion eventually dulled his own. The second is the principle of dharma, one's right and proper role. Krishna teaches that fulfilling one's role well does not require gripping every outcome personally, but rather trusting the larger order, the way a captain trusts a well-trained crew to fulfill their own roles faithfully. The navigator's counsel to Dorian to rest, to trust, to release the wheel without releasing his responsibility echoes this same ancient teaching. But right action and total control are not, in fact, the same thing at all. Think of the family trip you have planned down to every last detail, certain that if you are not the one driving, booking, and double-checking every reservation, something will surely go wrong. Think of the work project where you stay up long past midnight reviewing a deliverable a trusted colleague has already finished competently, simply because letting it go without your final pass feels, somehow, like risking everything. Notice the particular fatigue that comes from never resting the helm, never trusting another hand, never believing the ship can hold its course without your continuous grip. Notice it too in the way you check a teenager's homework line by line after they have already proofread it themselves. Or call a sibling repeatedly during a task you delegated to them days ago, certain your own watching is the only thing standing between order and disaster. And notice gently what it might feel like to hand the wheel to someone you have already trained well. At work, at home, even within your own mind, where some part of you has been steering far too long without rest. You do not need to decide anything tonight. Simply feel what it would be like to go below deck for a while, trusting that the course you have already set and the hands you have already prepared can hold steady through the night. The same night now settling gently around you, carrying you, too, toward rest. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a Taoist teaching about a leader who completes great work and then withdraws, claiming none of it for himself. Lao Tzu wrote that when the work is finished, the name should retire, that achievement clung to becomes a burden, while achievement released becomes lasting. A leader who carves his name into every accomplishment, who insists the world remember precisely whose effort built what stands before them, often finds that the very insistence shortens how long the work and the memory of it actually survives. Something built for the builder's glory tends to crumble alongside that glory once it fades. Something built and then quietly released tends to outlast its maker entirely, because no one feels obligated to defend or dismantle a single person's legacy attached to it. The bridge stands because it is useful, not because someone's name is carved into its stones. People cross it daily without a thought for who first laid its foundation, and the bridge does not seem to mind this in the slightest. Lao Tzu suggests this is the deeper secret of lasting influence. The work that asks for no credit is, paradoxically, the work most likely to be remembered, cared for, and carried forward by people who never even knew whose hands first built it. There was once a queen regent named Avela who ruled a small kingdom during her young nephew's childhood, and who could not bear to miss a single council meeting, no matter how minor the matter under discussion. She attended every gathering of advisers personally, even disputes over grain tariffs and footpath repairs that her ministers were entirely capable of resolving without her. She insisted on being seen presiding over every decision, certain that her visible presence was the thread holding the kingdom's stability together. Her ministers grew accustomed to deferring every judgment to her, even small ones, since deciding anything without her felt, after years of habit, almost disloyal. The kingdom functioned, but slowly, every decision routed through a single woman who had, without quite realizing it, made herself the bottleneck for matters that did not require a queen's attention at all. A Buddhist monk traveling through the kingdom on pilgrimage was invited to advise the council on an unrelated matter of land disputes near a monastery. He observed several council sessions in silence before Avela finally asked his opinion of what he had witnessed. "You attend every meeting," the monk said, "even the smallest ones. May I ask why?" "Because the people need to see their queen ruling," Avela said. "If I am absent even once, they may wonder whether I am still capable, still attentive, still in command of this kingdom. And if you attended only the meetings that truly required your judgment and trusted your ministers with the rest, Then word might spread that the queen does not concern herself with the smaller matters of her people. Avela said, I cannot risk appearing distant. The monk considered this for a long moment, folding his hands. There is a story we tell among my order of a gardener who tended a single tree his entire life, watering it every single day without fail, even during the rainy season when the rain alone would have been more than sufficient. And what became of the tree? It drowned, the monk said simply. Not from neglect, but from a gardener who could not trust the rain to do its own work, who believed his daily presence at the tree's roots was the only thing keeping it alive, even when the rain had already provided everything the tree required. Avela frowned. Are you saying my presence is drowning my kingdom? I am saying a kingdom, like a tree, needs different things at different times, the monk said. Sometimes it needs the gardener's hand directly. Sometimes it needs only to be left to what is already nourishing it. Capable ministers, established law, a quiet competence of people who have served this kingdom long before you arrived and will likely serve it long after you are gone. But if I step back, who will the people credit when the kingdom thrives? The monk smiled gently at this, the first time he had smiled during the entire conversation. Ah, now we have found the true root of the matter. It is not truly about whether the kingdom needs you in every meeting. It is about whether you can bear the kingdom thriving without every eye turning to credit you specifically for it. Avela sat with this, uncomfortable in a way she had not expected. Is that such a terrible thing to want? To be remembered as the one who held this kingdom together during a difficult time? Not terrible, the monk said. Only worth examining honestly. Ask yourself which matters more to you, that the kingdom thrives, or that the thriving is traced back to your own hand. They are not always the same wish, though they often wear the same face. They feel the same to me right now, Avela admitted. That is the most honest thing you have said all morning, the monk replied, smiling again. It is a very human thing to want, he continued. But consider, the bridges your grandfather built still stand, do they not? Though most who cross them never think of his name at all. Do they stand less proudly for being unremembered, or do they simply stand sturdy and useful, exactly as bridges are meant to? They stand, Avela admitted. Attachment to being seen as the source of good things, the monk said, is itself a kind of suffering in my tradition. It chains the good work to your own ego, so that the work cannot be fully appreciated for its own sake, only for what it proves about you. Release that attachment, even slightly, and the work becomes lighter to carry, both for you and for everyone who benefits from it, without needing to thank you personally for every small kindness. Avela did not change everything that week. She still attended the major councils, still made the decisions that truly required a queen's judgment, but she began, slowly, to let smaller disputes resolve themselves among her ministers without her presence hovering over every word, and found, to her quiet surprise, that the kingdom did not crumble in her absence from those rooms. If anything, her ministers grew steadier, more confident, more willing to resolve matters competently on their own, no longer waiting for a queen's nod before trusting their own judgment. When her young nephew finally came of age and took the throne himself, The transition unsettled almost no one in the kingdom, since so many of its quiet workings had already learned to continue without a regent's constant hand. Years afterward, an old minister remarked to him that his aunt had governed more wisely in her final seasons as regent than in her first, though far fewer people by then could say exactly what she had done. Avela, hearing of the remark, found she did not mind at all, and though she occasionally missed the feeling of being needed in every room, she found something else settling in its place, a kingdom that seemed to run a little more smoothly, a little more like a tree finally allowed to drink from rain that had been falling generously all along. In Buddhist teaching, there is a similar understanding of the suffering caused by clinging even to good outcomes we ourselves helped create. The concept of anatta, or non-self, suggests that the rigid sense of "I did this, therefore I deserve credit for this," is itself a kind of illusion, one that causes unnecessary suffering when the credit is questioned, shared, or simply forgotten by others over time. There are two threads worth holding here. The first is the practice of dedication of merit, common in many Buddhist traditions, where good actions are deliberately offered outward, to all beings, to the well-being of others, rather than hoarded inward as personal achievement, dissolving the grip of ego before it can take hold at all. The second is the teaching of impermanence, anicca, which reminds us that any credit clung to tightly will eventually slip away regardless, whether through forgetting, time, or simple human nature, and that peace comes from releasing the grip before life releases it for us. Avela's fear of being forgotten, the Buddhist teaching would suggest, was simply attachment wearing the costume of responsibility. And the monk's quiet question about the bridge revealed gently how much lighter the same good work becomes once that attachment is finally set down. Perhaps you recognize Avela's fear in your own life, the family gathering you organize each year, where some quiet part of you needs everyone to know how much effort went into it, how little anyone could manage without your planning. Perhaps it shows up at work, in the project you contributed to generously, only to feel a small ache when someone else receives the recognition for work you both built together. Notice how much energy goes into needing to be seen as the source of good outcomes, rather than simply allowing the good outcomes to exist on their own. Notice what it costs you to track, quietly, who has thanked you and who has not, who remembers your contribution and who has perhaps simply moved on to enjoy the result without a second thought. There is nothing wrong with wanting to be appreciated, but tonight simply feel what it might be like to set that need down for a while, the way a tree releases what it no longer requires to grow. Let your good work exist quietly, unattached, the way rain falls on a garden without ever asking the garden to remember its name, and let that quiet release carry you gently towards sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching in the Tao Te Ching about how true authority is built on trust rather than fear, and how fear, though it may produce quick obedience, builds nothing that lasts. Lao Tzu observed that when trust is insufficient, people obey only because they are afraid, and the moment that fear lifts, obedience lifts with it. Trust, by contrast, does not need to be renewed by threat. It survives the leader's absence. It survives seasons of hardship that would shatter a structure built only on intimidation. A leader who governs through fear must be present constantly, reinforcing that fear again and again, because fear is a fire that burns out the moment the fuel is withdrawn. A leader who governs through trust can step away entirely and find the structure still standing when she returns, because what was built was never dependent on her continuous presence to begin with. The quieter foundation, oddly enough, turns out to be the sturdier one. There was once a foreman named Itzhal who oversaw a crew of stonecutters building a temple wall, and who had developed the habit over many years of presenting every finished section of wall to the temple elders as though he alone had cut and placed each stone. His crew noticed, of course. They worked long days under the sun, hauling and shaping the heavy stones, and watched Itzhal walk the elders along the completed wall each evening, gesturing at sections he had barely touched, speaking of my work and what I built here, as though the calloused hands of a dozen other men had contributed nothing at all. The crew's spirit, once strong, had begun to dim. They still worked competently because they took pride in good stonework regardless of who claimed it, but something had gone quiet in them, some willingness to offer more than the minimum that Itzhal's constant credit-taking had slowly worn away. An old rabbi from a nearby village, visiting to discuss matters of temple law, happened to walk the wall one evening alongside Itzhal and overheard him claiming credit for a particularly fine section of carved stone that, in truth, a young apprentice named Bensio had spent 3 days perfecting. The rabbi said nothing in front of the elders, but afterward, as the workers gathered their tools for the night, he found Itzhal alone and asked gently, "Tell me, who cut that beautiful section near the eastern gate?" "I oversaw it," Itzhal said carefully. "I did not ask who oversaw it. I asked who cut it." Itzhal hesitated. "One of my crew, Bensio." "And does Bensio know how fine that stone looks set into the wall where everyone passing through the gate will see it for the next 100 years? I am sure he is satisfied with his work." "Satisfied," the rabbi repeated, turning the word over. "There is a teaching among my people that a person who claims credit for another's labor steals something more valuable than the labor itself. They steal the joy that was meant to belong to the one who actually did the work. Bensio spent 3 days perfecting that stone. Does he know the elders admired it tonight? They admired the wall," Itzhal said. "I did not specify which stone belonged to whom." "Exactly," the rabbi said. "You let the praise settle over the whole wall like a fog, vague enough that it could land on you without anyone noticing it should have landed somewhere else first." He paused. "May I ask you something foreman to foreman, though I have never laid a stone in my life?" "Ask." "Do you believe your crew works harder because they think the credit is yours, or do you believe they would work even harder still if they believed the credit was rightfully theirs?" Itzhal opened his mouth to answer quickly, then stopped, considering the question more honestly than he wanted to. "I had not thought of it that way. Most leaders have not thought of it at all, the rabbi said. It is easier not to. Thinking of it honestly tends to ask something uncomfortable of us. He paused, letting the evening settle a moment, before continuing more gently. We assume credit is a single thing, a fixed quantity, and that giving it away to others somehow diminishes our own. But I have seen the opposite proven many times. A worker who is named specifically for fine work does not merely feel proud for a moment. He begins to build a reputation of his own, one that makes him want to protect it with future excellent work. A worker who is never named for anything begins eventually to wonder why he should give his very best effort to a wall that will only ever be remembered as someone else's. Itzo looked down the length of the wall in the fading light, thinking of Bensio's careful hands, of a dozen other workers whose names he had never once mentioned to the elders in years of building. If I begin naming them, will it not seem as though I have done less myself? Perhaps, for a season, the rabbi said. But consider what you will gain instead, a crew that trusts you to see them rightly, a crew that works not merely competently, but generously, because they know their effort will be recognized rather than absorbed silently into your own name. That kind of trust does not need to be rebuilt every morning through fear of disappointing you. It simply holds, season after season, because it was built honestly in the first place. The next evening, when the elders walked the wall again, Itzo did something he had never done before. He stopped them at the eastern gate and told them plainly that the fine carving they were admiring belonged to a young stonecutter named Bensio, whose skill, he said, was becoming the finest in the crew. He watched Bensio's face from a distance, the quiet surprise and pride that crossed it, and felt something shift in his own chest that he had not expected. Not loss, as he had feared, but a strange, unfamiliar lightness, as though he had set down a stone he had been carrying for years without quite noticing its weight. He continued the habit through the rest of that temple wall's construction, naming a different worker each week for whatever section deserved it most. The crew's work did not slow under this new attention. It sharpened, each stonecutter working a little more carefully, knowing that careful work might finally be seen as theirs rather than vanishing quietly into the foreman's name. When the wall was finished, the temple elders asked Itzo who deserved the greatest credit for it. He gave them 7 names before his own, and found, to his quiet satisfaction, that he did not miss being the only name they remembered. In Hasidic Jewish teaching, there is a similar understanding of leadership rooted in humility and the dangers of claiming what belongs to another. The tradition speaks often of the tzaddik, the righteous leader, whose greatness is measured not by how much he is praised, but by how faithfully he serves and elevates those around him, sometimes deliberately stepping back so that a student's accomplishment can shine without the teacher's shadow falling across it. There are 2 threads worth holding here. The first is the teaching attributed to several Hasidic masters that true leadership lifts others rather than positioning itself above them. A Rebbe is meant to be a conduit for blessing, not a collector of it. The second is the practice, common in many Hasidic communities, of attributing wisdom and insight to the chain of teachers who came before, rather than claiming originality, understanding that credit honestly distributed strengthens the whole community's trust far more than credit hoarded by any single figure. Itzo's crew, the Hasidic teaching would suggest, needed not merely fair wages or good treatment, but the dignity of being seen and named, the same dignity a wise Rebbe extends to a student whose insight he could easily have claimed as his own, and chooses instead to credit rightly. Perhaps you recognize Itzhak in the way you describe a family project to others, quietly letting the credit for a child's accomplishment or a partner's effort settle onto your own account because the praise felt good and you did not correct it. Perhaps it shows up at work, in the report you presented, where a colleague's careful research went unmentioned, not from malice, but simply because naming them never crossed your mind in the moment. Notice how much smaller these omissions seem in passing, and how much they accumulate over time in the people around you. The quiet dimming of effort that happens when contribution goes consistently unseen. Notice it too in the friend whose advice solved a problem you later presented to others as your own clever idea. The small theft of credit that felt harmless at the time and yet left a friendship slightly quieter afterward. Notice too what it might feel like to name someone specifically tonight, even in your own thoughts, for work they did that you have not yet acknowledged. There is no need to fix anything right now. Simply feel the lightness of giving credit away freely, the way Itzhak felt something unclench in his chest once he stopped hoarding what was never fully his. And let that same lightness settle over you now as your body prepares for sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching about the danger of a leader who must always be seen acting in order to feel that anything is truly under control. Lao Tzu wrote that the Tao Jing itself works through stillness, that the sage accomplishes great things by remaining quiet, observant, and unhurried, rather than constantly stirring activity to prove that something is being done. A restless leader often confuses visible motion with actual progress, intervening simply because intervention feels like leadership, even when the wisest action available is no action at all. This restlessness is exhausting, both for the leader and for everyone forced to react to a constant stream of unnecessary adjustments. Worse, it often disrupts what was already functioning quietly and well, the way a hand that keeps adjusting a perfectly balanced scale only succeeds in tipping it. Stillness in this teaching is not laziness. It is a discipline, the hardest one, perhaps, for a person who has come to believe that being seen working is the same thing as actually leading well. There was once an orchestra conductor named Soren who could not allow a single passage of music to play without his visible cue. Even after decades of leading the same musicians through pieces they had performed together more times than anyone could count. His arms moved constantly through every rehearsal, sharp and insistent. Even during passages the orchestra had played flawlessly for years without needing guidance. He believed that the moment his hands stopped moving, the music itself might simply stop, as though his gestures alone were holding the sound together in the air. His musicians, many of them masters of their instruments with decades of experience, had grown weary of cues they no longer needed, small interruptions to a rhythm their own bodies had long since memorized. The orchestra played correctly under Soren's constant direction, but something in the performances had grown stiff, mechanical, as though the musicians were following his hands rather than feeling the music breathe on its own. A retired concertmaster, who had once led the same orchestra decades before Soren's arrival, came to observe a rehearsal at the invitation of an old friend among the cellists. He watched Soren's arms move through an entire symphony, cueing even the simplest, most familiar passages, and afterward found him resting backstage, visibly drained from the effort of conducting every single note. "You looked tired tonight," the old concertmaster said. "Conducting is tiring work," Soren said. "Every musician needs guidance. Every measure needs shape. It is constant labor." "Does it need to be constant?" the old man asked. "I watched the third movement closely. Your cellist did not need your hand to know when to enter. She has played that entrance for 15 years. Her body knew it before your arm rose at all." Soren frowned. "If I stop cueing her, how will she know I trust her timing?" "Perhaps by your stillness," the old man said. "There is a moment in great music when the conductor's task is not to add anything more, but simply to let the orchestra play what it already knows how to play, undisturbed. I remember a passage decades ago where I stopped conducting entirely for 8 measures, just stood there, let the orchestra carry itself. And what happened? The most beautiful 8 measures of that entire season," the old man said, smiling at the memory. "Because the musicians, freed briefly from my direction, played not for my cue, but for the music itself. They listened to each other instead of to me. It was the only time in my career an entire string section told me afterward that they had felt truly free during a performance." Soren considered this uneasily. "But surely some passages require a firm hand. Difficult entrances, tempo changes, moments where the orchestra could easily drift apart without guidance." "Of course," the old man agreed. "I am not suggesting you abandon the baton entirely. I am asking whether you have ever paused to notice which passages genuinely need your hand, and which ones you cue purely from habit, because stillness on the podium feels to you like failing at your job." Soren sat with this a long while, turning his baton slowly between his fingers. "I think I'm afraid that if I stop moving, people will believe I'm not working. That stillness looks like absence. To an audience watching your hands, perhaps," the old man said, "but the musicians are not watching your hands the way the audience is. They are listening to each other. Your stillness to them does not read as absence. It reads as trust, which is a far rarer thing for a conductor to offer than another cue." "I had never thought of it as something I could offer," Soren admitted. "I thought of it only as something I was failing to provide." "It can look that way," the old man said. "But the finest conductors I ever played under understood something rare. That knowing exactly when not to move is a far harder skill than knowing how to move constantly. Any conductor can wave a baton through every measure of a symphony. Very few can trust their orchestra enough to simply listen for 8 measures and let the music prove it does not need them every single moment to remain beautiful. The following week, during a passage the orchestra had performed together for over a decade, Soren lowered his arms and simply listened, letting the strings carry the melody entirely on their own judgment. He felt in that stillness an old fear rising, that he was failing, that he was visibly doing nothing while everyone watched. But the orchestra did not falter. If anything, the passage breathed more freely than it had in years, the musicians leaning into each other's timing rather than his hands, finding a warmth in the music that no amount of cueing had ever produced. After the performance, his lead violinist approached him quietly, something she had never done in all their years together. "That passage felt different tonight," she said. "Like we were finally trusted to play it the way we already hear it in rehearsal, among ourselves, when you are not watching." Soren asked her carefully whether the orchestra had ever discussed this among themselves before. She admitted they had more than once, though none of them had felt it was their place to mention it to him directly. "We did not want you to think we no longer valued your direction," she said, "only that some passages have lived inside us so long we hardly need to be told how they go anymore." Soren did not become a still conductor overnight, but he began slowly to trust the long silences where his hands had nothing left to add, and discovered that an orchestra, much like a wall built by many hands, sometimes plays its finest music precisely when the conductor finally allows himself to disappear into it. In Japanese Zen, there is a similar understanding found in the concept of mu, sometimes translated as emptiness or the pregnant pause, and in the principle of ma, the meaningful space between things. Zen teaching holds that the gaps in a brushstroke, the silence between notes, the pause in a conversation are not absences to be filled, but essential elements of the whole, carrying as much meaning as the marks or sounds surrounding them. There are two threads worth holding here. The first is the practice found in Japanese tea ceremony, where deliberate stillness and unhurried silence are considered as important as any spoken word or physical movement, teaching the practitioner that restraint itself can be a form of generous attention. The second is the Zen teaching of mushin, or no mind, the state in which a skilled practitioner acts or refrains from acting without the interference of anxious, self-conscious thought, the very state Soren glimpsed briefly when he lowered his arms and simply trusted the music to carry itself. Soren's restless baton, the Zen tradition would suggest, was filling a space that needed, instead, to remain open. And the 8 measures of silence the old concertmaster once offered his own orchestra were not an absence of leadership at all, but its quietest and most generous form. You may notice something of Soren in the way you run a family gathering, narrating every step of the meal preparation aloud, even when everyone in the kitchen already knows their part. You may notice it at work, in the meeting where you cannot let a comfortable silence sit for even a few seconds before filling it with another instruction, another reminder, another cue that nobody in the room actually needed. Notice how much of your own effort lately has gone into the appearance of guiding things rather than the quieter work of trusting what is already moving well on its own. Notice it, too, in the way you narrate a familiar drive to a passenger who has made the same trip 100 times, naming each turn aloud as though the route might otherwise be forgotten. Notice what it might feel like to lower your hands tonight, metaphorically speaking, and let one part of your life play its own familiar passage without your constant direction. You do not need to decide where to apply this. Simply feel for a moment the relief of stillness. The same stillness now settling into the room around you, into your own shoulders, into the quiet measure of your breath as it slows, unhurried, towards sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a Taoist teaching about leadership as a kind of hosting rather than commanding. The sage as the gracious host of a gathering, attending to needs quietly, removing obstacles before guests even notice them, never positioning himself as the center of attention his own hospitality has made possible. Lao Tzu described the highest good as being like water, which benefits all things and competes with nothing, settling humbly into the low places others overlook. A leader who hosts in this way does not need the gathering to revolve around him. He simply ensures, quietly and often invisibly, that everyone present has what they need to flourish. This requires a particular kind of attentiveness, noticing the empty cup before it is mentioned, the quiet guest who has not yet found their place, the small friction that could be smoothed before it becomes a real obstacle. None of this announces itself. None of this asks to be thanked. And yet a gathering hosted this way often leaves its guests with the sense that something good simply happened on its own, without quite realizing how carefully it had been tended all along. There was once a midwife named Kalanta, who had attended hundreds of births across her long years of practice, and who could not bring herself to leave a single birth entirely to the mother and her own body, even when everything was proceeding exactly as it should. She hovered constantly, checking and rechecking what she had already confirmed only minutes before, offering instructions even during the quiet stretches of labor when the wisest thing to do was simply wait. Mothers under her care often found themselves more anxious after Kalantha's frequent interruptions than they had been before she arrived, picking up on her restlessness the way a room picks up on a draft. Her young apprentice, a woman named Priyana, who had trained under her for 2 years, noticed this pattern again and again, though she had never found the courage to mention it. She watched Kalantha check a laboring mother's progress for the 4th time in under an hour, each check interrupting a rhythm of breathing the mother had only just settled into. One evening, after a birth that had gone smoothly despite Kalantha's constant intervention, Priyana finally asked carefully, "Do you ever worry that checking so often might disturb something that was already going well?" Kalantha looked at her sharply at first, then softened, considering the question rather than dismissing it. "I worry more about missing something if I do not check. A birth can turn difficult in moments. I would rather catch trouble early than discover it too late." "I understand that fear," Priyana said, "but I have noticed something else. Tonight, the mother's breathing had found a good rhythm twice, and both times your hands on her belly seemed to break that rhythm, rather than confirm it was fine. She had to find her way back to it afterward." Kalantha sat with this, unused to being questioned so directly by someone she had trained herself. "Are you saying my care is causing harm?" "I am saying I have watched many births now," Priyana said gently, "and the ones that seem to go most peacefully are often the ones where we check carefully, but not constantly, where we trust the mother's own body and the natural rhythm of labor to do most of the work, stepping in only when something truly requires our hands." "And how do I know when something truly requires my hands, rather than simply my own worry asking to be soothed?" It was an honest question, and Priyana considered it carefully before answering. "I think, perhaps, by noticing whether the urge to check comes from something you have actually observed changing, or from a restlessness in yourself that has nothing to do with the mother at all. Tonight, I watched you check 4 times in an hour where nothing had changed since the previous check. I wonder if that was for her or for your own need to feel certain." Kalantha was quiet for a long moment, watching the sleeping mother and newborn across the room, both peaceful now after a labor that had, in truth, gone remarkably well despite her own restless hands throughout it. "I have attended birth for 30 years, she said slowly. "I have seen labors turn dangerous in an instant, and I have never forgiven myself for the ones I could not save. I think somewhere along the way, my checking stopped being about what the mother needed and became about quieting my own fear of being caught unprepared." "Which of those labors that turned dangerous," Priyana asked carefully, "were caught earlier because you checked more often, rather than because the danger simply announced itself the moment it arrived?" Kalantha thought hard about this, running through decades of memory. "Honestly," she admitted, "very few. Most dangers I have seen arrive suddenly with their own unmistakable signs. My constant checking rarely caught anything before it would have announced itself regardless." "That fear makes sense," Priyana said. "But I wonder if there is a way to honor it without letting it interrupt every peaceful rhythm a body finds on its own. The bees, my grandmother used to say, build their finest honey when the hive is left undisturbed for long stretches, opened only when truly necessary. Open it too often, even out of care, and you disturb the very work you meant to protect." Kalantha smiled faintly at this, the first real smile Priyana had seen from her in days. A midwife comparing herself to a beekeeper. My grandmother would have found that very amusing. "Perhaps it is not so different," Priyana said. "Both of us are tending something alive, something that mostly knows how to do its own work, if we can find the discipline to trust it more often than we interrupt it." In the months that followed, Kalantha did not stop checking on her laboring mothers, but she began, with effort, to lengthen the spaces between her checks, to trust the quiet stretches more than she once had, and to ask herself each time the urge to intervene arose whether it came from true necessity or simply old fear asking to be soothed. The births she attended did not become any less safe. If anything, the mothers seemed calmer, finding their own rhythms more easily without her hovering, and Kalantha found something unexpected settling into her own hands as well, a steadiness that came not from constant vigilance, but from finally trusting the long, ordinary stretches of labor to simply be what they were without her help. Priyana stayed in the village long enough to see one more birth through to its end, and watched Kalantha sit, hands folded, through nearly an hour of quiet labor she would once have spent hovering at the bedside. When the child finally arrived, healthy and unhurried into the world, Kalantha looked up at Priyana with something like relief. Nothing went wrong in all that waiting, she said, as though still slightly amazed by it. I kept expecting it to. It simply did not. In Celtic wisdom, there is a similar understanding of the natural rhythms that govern living things and the wisdom of working with those rhythms rather than constantly interrupting them. The old Celtic reverence for the wheel of the year, the turning of seasons, reflects a deep trust that growth and birth unfold according to their own proper timing, and that the wisest hand is often the one that tends gently at the edges rather than forcing the center. There are two threads worth holding here. The first is the Celtic understanding of the thin places, moments and locations where the ordinary world and something deeper draw close together. Birth, in many old traditions, was considered one such threshold. Sacred precisely because it was not fully within human control and demanded reverence rather than constant management. The second is the old practice among Celtic herders and midwives alike of watchful waiting, a discipline of attentive presence that does not rush to intervene, trusting the same instincts that have carried mothers and animals through birth for countless generations before any single midwife arrived to help. Kalantha's restless hands, the Celtic tradition would suggest, were trying to manage a threshold that was never fully hers to control. And the quieter watchfulness Priyana modelled for her was simply an older, gentler way of honouring a process that had always known, mostly, how to unfold on its own. Perhaps you recognise Kalantha in the way you manage your child's homework, hovering at the table, correcting each small mistake before they have a chance to find it themselves. Perhaps it shows up in how you oversee a team project, checking in so frequently that your colleagues never have the uninterrupted stretch of time they need to find their own working rhythm. Notice the particular exhaustion of constant vigilance, the belief that something terrible might happen the moment you look away, even when nothing has actually signaled danger. Notice, too, what it might feel like to lengthen the space between your checks tonight, even slightly, trusting that whatever you are watching over has its own quiet capacity to continue without you. You do not need to resolve this fully tonight. Simply feel what it would be like to set your worry down for a few long, undisturbed minutes, the way a wise midwife finally learns to trust the rhythm already unfolding in the room, and let that same trust loosen your own breath now, drawing you gently toward rest. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching about the leader as servant, the one who positions himself not above the people, but among them, attending to their needs before attending to his own visibility. Lao Tzu wrote that the sage puts himself last, and yet finds himself somehow placed first by those he serves, not because he sought that position, but because genuine service tends to earn trust that command alone never quite manages. A leader who insists on visible superiority often finds people obeying out of obligation, while a leader who serves quietly without keeping score of the sacrifice often finds people following out of genuine devotion. This is not a strategy for gaining followers, though it sometimes produces that effect. It is simply a different orientation toward power altogether. One that asks what the people need rather than what the leader is owed. A community raised on service rather than command tends to remember its leader fondly long after the position itself has passed to someone new. There was once a caravan leader named Mbeki who guided traders across a wide, dry stretch of land between two great cities, and who distrusted every scout's judgment but his own, no matter how many years of experience the scout carried. He had led the caravan successfully for over a decade, surviving sandstorms and dry wells and the occasional bandit raid through skill earned the hard way. But that hard-earned skill had calcified over time into a conviction that no one else's eyes could be trusted to read the land as accurately as his own. His scouts, several of whom had grown up traveling this same route with their own families before joining Mbeki's caravan, had learned to keep their observations to themselves unless directly asked, since offering them unprompted often led to Mbeki dismissing their read of the terrain and insisting on checking it personally, costing the caravan precious hours of daylight. One evening, an elder from a community along the route known across the region for fostering a strong spirit of shared responsibility among her people, joined the caravan for several days as it passed near her village. She watched Mbeki ride out alone each morning to verify water sources his own scouts had already confirmed the night before, returning hours later, tired, having found exactly what the scouts had already told him. "You ride far each morning," the elder observed on the third day of this pattern. "I must see the water myself," Mbeki said. "A caravan's life depends on accurate information. I cannot risk a scout's error costing us our supply." "Have your scouts been wrong before?" Mbeki considered this honestly. "Rarely. Perhaps twice in 10 years. And in those 10 years, how many mornings have you ridden out to verify water that was, in fact, exactly where your scouts said it would be?" Mbeki did not have an exact number, but he understood uncomfortably that the answer was nearly every morning of every journey he had ever led. "I suppose nearly all of them. In my village," the elder said, "we have a saying that a person who carries the whole weight of a journey alone will eventually be crushed by it, even if the journey itself was never that heavy to begin with. We believe deeply in what we call collective strength, the understanding that I am because we are, that no single person's burden should be carried entirely alone when there are capable hands all around willing to share it. My scouts are capable," Mbeki admitted. "I do not doubt their skill. I only doubt whether I can trust anyone's eyes but my own with something this important." "Is water truly more important than the lives of the people walking beside you exhausted because their leader will not rest?" the elder asked. Mbeki had no answer for this. He sat in silence, the truth of the question settling somewhere uncomfortable in his chest. "And what does that distrust cost you?" the elder asked. "I have watched you ride out exhausted each morning, verifying water your scouts already found correctly, while they wait idle, their skill unused, their judgment treated as worthless despite years of proving otherwise. What do you imagine this teaches them, over time, about their place in this caravan? Mbeki was quiet for a long while, thinking of the young scout, barely 20, who had found the previous night's water source through a method Mbeki himself had never considered, reading subtle signs in the vegetation that Mbeki's older methods would have missed entirely. I suppose it teaches them that their judgment does not truly matter here, regardless of how good it actually is. And a person who believes their judgment does not matter, the elder said, eventually stops offering it at all, not out of laziness, but out of self-protection. Why offer your best thinking to someone who will only ride out and check it anyway? Mbeki sat with this through the rest of the elder's visit, watching his scouts with new attention, noticing how rarely they spoke up anymore, how thoroughly his constant verification had trained them into silence. The next morning, for the first time in years, he did not ride out to check the water. He simply trusted the report his lead scout had given him the night before, and the caravan moved forward on schedule, the water exactly where it had been promised. It took time for Mbeki's scouts to trust that his trust was genuine and not a temporary lapse. The young scout who had found the water source the night before, in particular, remained cautious for several days, half expecting Mbeki to ride out and check his next report as well. When that did not happen, he began volunteering small observations unprompted, a change in the soil, a distant dust cloud worth noting, testing in his own quiet way whether his voice was actually welcome now or merely tolerated. But over the following weeks, as Mbeki continued resisting the urge to verify everything personally, something in the caravan's spirit shifted. Scouts began offering observations again, unprompted, eager once more to share what their trained eyes noticed along the route. Mbeki found, to his quiet relief, that a caravan led by many trusted eyes moved with more confidence and considerably more rest for its leader than one led by a single exhausted man who believed every burden belonged to him alone. By the time the caravan reached its destination, weeks later than the elder's visit, Mbeki had stopped riding ahead entirely most mornings, content to let his scouts lead while he traveled near the rear, observing rather than verifying. A trader who had crossed with him many seasons before remarked at journey's end that this had been the smoothest crossing he had ever shared with Mbeki's caravan. Mbeki only smiled, thinking of how much of that smoothness belonged to scouts whose judgment he had finally allowed to matter. In the African philosophy of Ubuntu, there is a similar understanding of leadership and shared strength, often summarized in the phrase, "I am because we are." This philosophy holds that no person's wisdom, capability, or worth exists in isolation, but is woven together with the community around them, and that a leader who tries to carry every burden alone misunderstands the very nature of strength itself. There are two threads worth holding here. The first is the Ubuntu understanding that true leadership is relational rather than singular. A leader exists and finds meaning only in right relationship with those he leads, and a leader who treats his people's judgment as worthless has, in some sense, severed the relationship that gave his leadership its meaning in the first place. The second is the practice, found in many Ubuntu-influenced communities, of consensus-building decision processes that deliberately draw on the wisdom of many voices before a final course is set, trusting that collective discernment produces stronger outcomes than any single authority working alone, Mbeki's exhausting solo rides, the Ubuntu tradition would suggest, were never truly about water at all. They were about a leader who had forgotten for a time that his caravan's strength was never meant to rest on his shoulders alone. Perhaps you recognize Meiki in the way you double-check a partner's grocery list, certain you alone know which brand of bread the household actually prefers. Perhaps it shows up at work, in the way you review a junior colleague's analysis line by line, even when their track record has already proven repeatedly that their judgment can be trusted. Notice how exhausting it is to ride out every morning, verifying what has already been confirmed, to treat every capable person around you as though their competence requires your personal inspection before it counts. Notice it, too, in the way you reread a teenager's text message draft before letting them send it, or recount money a trusted family member has already counted twice in front of you. Notice, too, what it might feel like to trust one report tonight without checking it yourself, to let someone else's water source be enough. You do not need to decide this for every situation tonight. Simply feel what it would be like to let your shoulders lower slightly, the way a caravan moves more easily once the leader stops carrying every burden alone, and let that same easing settle into your body now as sleep begins to gather around you. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching about the leader who guides without forcing, much as a skilled rider guides a spirited horse, not by gripping the reins so tightly that the horse fights against the hand, but by sensing the horse's own intention and shaping it gently toward the desired path. Lao Tzu wrote of governing in accordance with the nature of things rather than against it, working with the grain of a situation rather than constantly forcing it against its own direction. A leader who grips too tightly creates resistance precisely where ease was possible. A leader who senses the natural movement already present and guides it rather than overriding it finds the path opening more easily than force could ever manage. This requires humility, the willingness to notice what is already happening before insisting on what should happen instead. It requires patience, since sensing a direction takes longer than simply commanding one. But what it produces, when done well, is a kind of cooperation that force alone could never produce, no matter how tightly the reins were held. There was once a navigator named Talai who guided ocean voyages between scattered islands using nothing but the stars, the swells, the flight patterns of seabirds, and a memory passed down through generations of her family before her. She had recently begun training a younger navigator named Hoani, a capable young man eager to learn, though their early voyages together had not gone smoothly. Talay found herself constantly correcting Hoani's readings, overriding his sense of the swells with her own without explaining why, certain that her decades of accumulated knowledge made any pause for explanation an unaffordable waste of time during an active voyage. Hoane had grown quieter with each correction, less willing to offer his own observations, deferring to Tale even on matters where his instincts, still developing, might have been worth voicing aloud. One calm evening, partway through a long crossing, Tale noticed Hoane staring at the swells with a troubled expression, clearly sensing something he was reluctant to mention. She asked him directly what he saw. "I think we have drifted slightly south of our heading," he said carefully. "The swell pattern feels different than it did an hour ago, but I am not certain enough to say so with confidence." Tale checked the stars, considered the swells herself, and found, to her surprise, that Hoane's instinct was correct. They had indeed drifted south, more than she had realized. "You were right," she said. "Why did you not say so sooner?" Hoane hesitated before answering honestly. "Because every time I have spoken up before, you have corrected me without explaining what I missed. I have started to doubt whether my own reading of the swells means anything at all compared to yours." Talai sat with this, the canoe rocking gently beneath them in the dark. "I did not realize I had taught you that." "I do not think you meant to," Hoane said, "but it is what happened anyway." "When I was learning," Talai said slowly, "my grandmother corrected me too, but she always told me why, what she felt in the swell that I had missed, what the bird's flight pattern suggested that I had not yet learned to notice. I think somewhere along the way with you, I stopped explaining and simply started correcting, because correcting felt faster." "It was faster," Hoane agreed, "but I'm not sure it taught me anything. Beyond not trusting my own instincts." Talai looked out at the dark water, the same water her grandmother had read for her decades before, and considered how differently she had been taught compared to how she had been teaching. "A wise old wayfinder once told my grandmother that you cannot force the ocean to agree with your heading. You can only learn to read what it is already telling you, and adjust your course gently in response. I think I forgot that the same is true of teaching a person to read it. I cannot force your instincts to match mine through correction alone. I can only help you learn to sense what is already there, the way the ocean taught me, slowly, swell by swell." "Then will you tell me what you felt tonight, before I noticed it myself?" Talai smiled in the dark, the first real smile of the voyage. "I felt the current shift slightly to the south about an hour before you mentioned it. I felt it in the rhythm of the swell against the hull, a change so small I almost dismissed it myself. I should have told you the moment I felt it, instead of waiting to see if you would catch up to what I already suspected." In the months that followed, Telai changed how she trained Hoane, explaining her reasoning rather than simply overriding his readings, asking what he sensed before declaring what she sensed herself. It was not always smooth. There were voyages where Hoane's reading and her own disagreed, and she had to resist the old habit of simply asserting her decades of experience as the final word, choosing instead to sit with him over the swell and trace, together, where their two readings diverged and why. More often than not, both of them learned something from the disagreement that neither would have learned alone. Hoane's confidence grew slowly, his instincts sharpening with every voyage until the night came, years later, when he caught a shift in the current before Telai herself had noticed it and corrected their heading on his own judgment, gently and confidently, the way a navigator works with the ocean rather than against it. Te Lai said nothing as he made the correction, watching from her place near the stern, resisting the old pull to confirm his reading aloud before he had finished trusting it himself. When he finally looked to her for confirmation, she only nodded and let the silence between them say what words might have undercut. Te Lai eventually trained 3 more young navigators after Huani, each one taught in the same patient manner: explanation before correction, question before declaration. When she grew too old to make the long crossings herself, all 4 of her former students were guiding canoes safely between the islands, none of them needing her presence at all, each carrying forward a way of teaching she had only learned to practice properly once, late in her own career, beside a young man who finally taught her something in return. In Polynesian wayfinding traditions, there is a similar understanding of guidance as a relationship with forces far larger than any single navigator, rather than a battle to be won through force or insistence. Traditional wayfinders read the ocean swells, the stars, the clouds, and the flight of birds, understanding that the sea has its own intentions and patterns that must be sensed and worked with, never simply overridden by human will. There are 2 threads worth holding here. The first is the deep respect within this tradition for apprenticeship, passed gently from elder to younger navigator, where knowledge is transmitted not through harsh correction, but through shared observation, patient explanation, and trust extended gradually as the student's instincts mature. The second is the wayfinder's core understanding that the ocean cannot be commanded, only read and cooperated with. A lesson that applies as readily to leading people as it does to leading a canoe safely between distant islands. Talei's early corrections of Hoani, the wayfinding tradition would suggest, mistook teaching for commanding, and the gentler explanation she eventually offered him was simply a return to the older way, the way her own grandmother had once guided her, swell by patient swell, toward trusting her own reading of the sea. Perhaps you recognize Te Lai's early mistake in the way you correct a teenager's approach to a household chore, taking over the task entirely rather than explaining what you noticed that they missed. Perhaps it shows up at work, in the way you redo a junior colleague's draft silently overnight, rather than walking them through your reasoning so their own instincts might sharpen over time. Notice how much quieter a household or a team becomes when correction arrives without explanation, how quickly people stop offering their own observations once those observations are routinely overridden without comment. Notice it in the friend who stopped suggesting restaurants after you overruled their choice one too many times without saying why, quietly deciding their preferences no longer mattered to the plan. Notice, too, what it might feel like to explain your reasoning gently tonight, even just in your own mind, rather than simply asserting that you are right. You do not need to apply this anywhere specific right now. Simply feel what it would be like to read the swell rather than fight it, to trust the gentle drift of your own evening rather than forcing it toward a particular shape. And let that same gentle trust carry you now towards sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching about the leader who walks behind, sensing the path rather than stamping it flat with heavy footsteps. Lao Tzu wrote that the sage puts himself last, and so finds himself first, not through some clever trick of strategy, but because a leader who is always pushing ahead, always announcing the way, drowns out the very signs that would have shown the way more clearly. Country, in many traditions far older than any single ruler, already knows its own paths. A guide who insists on imposing a route rather than reading the one already there disturbs the very thing he is trying to navigate. The wisest tracking is not loud. It listens before it leads and lets what is already present speak before adding a single instruction of its own. There was once a master tracker named Bidjara, who led hunting parties across wide, dry country that he had walked since childhood, and who insisted on walking at the very front of every party, pulling out each sign he noticed before anyone else had the chance to look for it themselves. He trained two younger trackers, Nagara and Walu, both promising, both eager, both increasingly silent on every hunt they shared with him. Bidjara called out broken grass before Nagara's eyes had even reached it. He named a trail of disturbed soil before Walu had finished crouching to examine it. He was, by any measure, extraordinarily skilled. He was also, without quite realizing it, teaching two skilled young trackers that their own eyes were unnecessary. One long, hot afternoon, the party paused at a dry creek bed, and Bidjara noticed that neither Angara nor Walu had spoken a single observation aloud all day. He asked them directly why they had gone so quiet. "Because you always see it first," Nagara admitted after a long pause. "By the time I notice something, you have already named it and moved on. I have stopped looking as carefully, because looking carefully does not seem to matter." "Is that true for you as well?" Bidjara asked Walu. "Yes," Walu said. "I used to love reading the ground. Now I mostly watch your back and wait to hear what you have already found." Bidjara sat with this, turning a small stone over in his fingers. "When I was young," he said slowly, "my own teacher walked behind the youngest tracker on every hunt, no matter how slow that tracker was, no matter how many signs he missed. I asked him once why he did not simply walk ahead and show us the quicker way." "What did he say?" Nagara asked. "He said that country reveals itself to whoever is actually looking, and that a teacher who is always looking first teaches his students never to look at all. He said the slowest tracker on a hunt often becomes the sharpest tracker years later, because he was given the years of looking that a faster guide would have stolen from him by simply naming everything first." "Then why have you not done the same with us?" Walu asked, not unkindly. Bidjara considered this honestly. "I think I enjoyed being the one who always saw it first," he admitted. "It is a pleasant feeling being needed in that particular way. I did not notice until just now what it was costing both of you." "What will you do instead?" Nagara asked. "I do not yet know," Bidjara admitted. "I have walked at the front of every hunt since I was younger than either of you. I am not certain I remember how to walk anywhere else." "Then perhaps you will have to learn it the same way we have been learning to read country," Walu said with the faintest trace of a smile. "Slowly and a little uncertainly, with someone patient enough to let you find your own way to it." Bijara laughed at that, surprised by it, the first real laugh either of them had heard from him in longer than they could remember. "Fair enough," he said. "Walk ahead of me tomorrow, both of you. I will try to stay quiet behind you, and we will see what country tells you when I am not the one speaking for it." He changed his position on the very next hunt, walking at the rear of the party instead of the front, saying nothing unless asked directly, even when he noticed signs minutes before either younger tracker did. It was, he found, considerably harder than walking ahead. The silence required real discipline. Twice he nearly spoke before catching himself, the words already rising in his throat before he managed to swallow them back down. The first hunt under this new arrangement was slower than any hunt Bijara had led in years. Ngara and Walu second-guessed themselves constantly, stopping to debate signs that Bijara could have named in an instant, circling back twice on a trail that turned out, eventually, to be the right one all along. Bijara stood at the rear through all of it, hands clasped tightly behind his back, every muscle in him wanting to step forward and simply tell them where the animal had gone. He did not. By the time they finally found the trail's end, the sun was low, and the party had walked twice the distance it might have under his old guidance. That took far longer than it needed to, Ngara said afterward, half apologizing. "It took exactly as long as it needed to," Bijara said, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. "You found it yourselves. That is worth more than the hour it cost us." By the third hunt, Walu noticed a broken branch that Bijara himself had nearly missed entirely. By the fifth, Ngara read a shift in the wind correctly before Bijara had even registered the change himself. "You used to see everything first," Walu said to him one evening, almost wondering aloud. "I did," Bijara said, "and you saw nothing because there was nothing left for you to see? Now there is country in front of you that has not yet been named by anyone else's eyes. That is the only way your own eyes ever learned to read it." Years later, when Bijara had grown too old to walk the long hunts, Ngara and Walu led the parties themselves, walking at the rear, naming nothing unless asked, watching the next generation of young trackers slowly learn to see country for themselves, the way Bijara had finally, late in his own life, learned to let them. Among Aboriginal Australian traditions, songlines carry knowledge of country across vast distances, sung and walked by countless generations, each custodian responsible for keeping a particular stretch of the line alive rather than reshaping it according to personal preference. A songline is not authored by any single voice. It is carried faithfully by whoever walks it next. Two threads from this tradition speak directly to Bijara's late discovery. The first is the deep respect for country's own knowledge, understood as something already present, already patterned, waiting to be read rather than imposed upon. A guide's task is to notice what country is already saying, not to announce a path invented from nothing. The second is the careful, patient way knowledge is transmitted between generations along a song line, never rushed, never simply handed over in finished form, but walked together repeatedly until the younger custodian can hear what the elder hears. Bijara's early habit of naming every sign before his students could look for themselves, the songline tradition would suggest, mistook fast transmission for true transmission. What he eventually recovered, walking behind, naming nothing, trusting younger eyes to find their own way into country's patterns, echoes precisely how a songline is meant to be carried forward, not delivered all at once, but discovered again slowly by each new voice that learns to sing it. Perhaps you recognize Bijara's early habit in the way you finish a child's sentence before they have found the right word themselves, or answer a question in a meeting before a quieter colleague has had the chance to offer their own thought. Perhaps it shows up in how quickly you point out a mistake in someone else's work, rather than letting them notice it on their own first. Notice how much is lost when every observation is made for someone else before they can make it themselves. Not the correctness of the observation, but the muscle of noticing, which only grows through use. Notice it, too, in the way you point out a typo before a friend has finished proofreading their own letter, or supply the punchline to a story someone else was clearly enjoying the telling of. Notice, too, what it might feel like to walk behind tonight in your own mind, rather than always leading the way your thoughts tend to run. You do not need to lead anything right now. Simply let your own thoughts walk a little behind you this evening, trusting that whatever needs to be noticed will surface in its own quiet time. And let that same patient trust carry you gently towards sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching about the leader who tends without disturbing, the way a careful hand might tend a living thing that thrives precisely because it is left mostly alone. Lao Tzu wrote of governing a great country the way one might fry a small fish. Too much turning, too much poking, and the delicate thing falls apart in the pan. A hive of bees does not need a keeper who opens it every hour to confirm that the bees are working. It needs a keeper who trusts the work that is already happening, who intervenes rarely and only with real cause. The leader who must constantly check on what is thriving often becomes the very reason it stops thriving. Sometimes the most active form of care is the discipline of leaving something alone. There was once a beekeeper named Yashek who kept hives behind his family's home, and who could not pass within sight of them without stopping to lift a lid, however briefly, to confirm with his own eyes that all was well inside. His hives produced less honey each year, a fact that troubled him deeply, though he could not understand why, given how closely he attended to them. His neighbor, an old woman named Itzel, who had kept bees for nearly 50 years, produced honey enough to trade across 3 villages from hives she seemed, by comparison, to barely touch. One early summer morning, Yashek finally asked her directly what he was doing wrong. "How often do you open your hives?" Itzel asked him. "Every day," he said, "sometimes twice if I'm worried about the weather." "And how often do I open mine?" she asked. "I have seen you open a hive perhaps once a month," he admitted. "Sometimes less. The bees do not need to be checked on," Itzel said. They need to be left to do what bees already know how to do. Every time you lift that lid, you let out the warmth they have been building. You disturb the very air they are working to keep steady. You interrupt them again and again in the name of caring for them. But how do I know they are well if I do not look? Yashek asked. You watch from outside, Itzel said. You notice how many bees are coming and going at the entrance. You notice the hum, whether it sounds steady or troubled. You learn to read what is visible without disturbing what is hidden. And when something is genuinely wrong, when the hum changes, when the bees stop returning, then you open the hive with real purpose and not before. Yashek considered this. It feels strange to care for something by leaving it alone. It felt strange to me too when I was young, Itzel said. My own grandmother kept bees the same way I do now, and I used to think she was simply lazy, until my hives started failing under my constant attention and hers kept thriving under her apparent neglect. It was not neglect. It was a different kind of watching, patient, from a slight distance, trusting the bees to know their own work. What if I am wrong and something is actually failing inside and I simply cannot see it from outside? Yashek asked. Then you will see it, Itzel said. The hum will tell you. The pattern of bees at the entrance will tell you. Bees are not silent about real trouble. They are only silent about your impatience, which is not the same thing as trouble at all. How long before I trust what I am seeing, rather than my old habit of needing to check? Yashek asked. Longer than you would like, Itzel said, not unkindly. I checked my own restraint for 2 full seasons before it stopped feeling like a risk and started feeling like simple good sense. You will doubt yourself many mornings before this becomes easy. That doubt does not mean you are doing it wrong. It only means you are doing something your hands are not yet used to. Yashek tried it that summer, with real difficulty at first. He stood near his hives many mornings, hands at his sides resisting the pull to lift the lid, listening instead to the hum, watching the bees come and go. It felt, for weeks, like doing nothing at all, like a kind of negligence dressed up as wisdom. Midway through that first month, a storm passed through the valley, and Yashek nearly broke his new discipline entirely, certain the hives must have suffered some damage he could not see from outside. He stood at the entrance the next morning, hands trembling slightly with the effort of not lifting the lid, and forced himself instead to simply watch. The bees came and went steadily, the hum even and unhurried, no sign of distress in either. He stood there a long while, almost disappointed at how unremarkable the moment turned out to be, before understanding that the lack of drama was itself the answer he had been afraid to trust. By late summer, his hives had produced more honey than they had in 3 years. He told Itzel this, half expecting her to be surprised. She was not. You did not do nothing, she said. You did the harder thing. You watched without disturbing. That is not less work. It is simply a kind of work that does not look like work until the honey proves it was. Yashek kept the new habit through the following years, even as his confidence grew and the old anxious pull to check faded into something more like fondness. A quiet pleasure in standing near the hives without needing to open them at all. Younger beekeepers from neighboring farms began visiting him for advice, expecting some clever technique for coaxing more honey from a hive. He gave them the same answer Itzel had once given him, watching their faces struggle as his own once had, to believe that doing less could really be the secret they had come so far to learn. In Mayan cosmology, the bee held a sacred place, embodied in Muzen Kab, a deity closely tied to honey, abundance, and the careful tending of the natural world. Ancient Mayan beekeepers developed sophisticated practices around the stingless bees native to the region, practices built on patient observation rather than constant intervention, understanding the hive as a living system with its own intelligence that human hands could support but never truly command. Two threads from this tradition speak to Yashek's late discovery. The first is the deep reverence for cycles that unfold according to their own internal timing. The Mayan calendar systems themselves reflect a worldview built around trusting larger patterns rather than forcing immediate, visible control over every unfolding moment. The second is the specific beekeeping wisdom passed down through generations, which emphasized reading external signs of a hive's health rather than disturbing its interior unnecessarily, much as Itzel taught Yashek to read the hum and the entrance rather than lifting every lid. Yashek's early habit of constant checking, this tradition would suggest, mistook visible attention for genuine care, when the deeper wisdom, honored across centuries by those who tended bees long before either Yashek or Itzel were born, understood that some of the most devoted care looks, from the outside, like simply leaving something alone. Perhaps you recognize Yashek's habit in the way you check on a sleeping child every few minutes, rather than trusting the quiet, or refresh a message thread repeatedly, rather than letting a conversation breathe on its own timeline. Perhaps it shows up in how often you ask a recovering friend whether they are truly fine, when your asking, however loving, sometimes interrupts the very rest they are trying to find. Notice how much steadier something can become when it is allowed to simply continue, unobserved, for a while. Notice it, too, in the garden you dig up to inspect the roots before they have had a season to settle, or the new habit you abandon early simply because the first few days did not show the change you were hoping to measure. Notice, too, what it might feel like tonight to trust that whatever needs your attention will make itself known, clearly, without your constant checking. You do not need to check on anything right now. Simply let this moment hum quietly, undisturbed, the way a hive works best when the lid stays closed, and let that same trust carry you gently towards sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching about the leader whose strength comes from what he is willing to release rather than what he insists on holding. Lao Tzu wrote that a tree too rigid in the wind breaks, while one that bends survives the storm entirely. True strength, again and again in his teaching, looks far more like yielding than like gripping. The leader who must personally finish every piece of work, who cannot release a single task into another's hands, eventually finds himself exhausted by the very strength he believed made him indispensable. There is a deeper kind of mastery available to anyone willing to let a trusted hand finish what they themselves began, one that does not diminish the leader at all, but multiplies what a single pair of hands could ever have accomplished alone. There was once a master smith named Brandvor, who forged weapons for a northern hall, and who would not let a single blade leave his workshop unless his own hands had struck every final blow upon it, no matter how skilled his apprentices had become at the earlier stages of the work. His apprentice Sultan had grown remarkably capable over several years, his early work clumsy, his recent work nearly indistinguishable from the master's own. Yet Brandvor still took every blade from Sultan's hands at the final stage, finishing it personally, presenting it to the hall's warriors as entirely his own work, never mentioning the hours of skilled labor Sultan had already poured into it. One winter evening, an old smith named Halvar, long retired, visited the hall and watched Brandvor finish a blade that Sultan had clearly shaped through nearly its entire length. "That young man did most of that work," Halvar observed quietly, once Sultan had stepped outside. "He did," Brandvor admitted. "But the final temper, the final edge, that must be exact or the blade fails in battle. I cannot risk that to anyone's hands but my own." "Has his temper ever failed, when you have tested his work in private?" Halvar asked. Brandvor hesitated. "No," he said, "not in over a year." "Then whose risk are you actually managing?" Halvar asked. "The blade's, or your own need to be the one who finished it?" Brandvor was quiet for a long moment, the forge fire crackling between them. "I think," he said slowly, "I have been afraid that if his work is good enough to stand on its own, mine will no longer be needed at all." "That is an old fear," Halvar said, not unkindly. "Nearly every smith worth his trade carries it somewhere, usually buried beneath the pride that looks from the outside like simple high standards. When I was your age," Halvar continued, "I believed exactly the same thing. I held on to every final stroke for 15 years, refusing to let a single trained hand finish what I considered mine to complete. Do you know what happened when I finally stopped?" "What happened?" "My name traveled further than it ever had, carried by 12 smiths I had trained well enough to trust completely. Each blade they finished still carried something of what I had taught them. I did not become less needed. I became present in 12 workshops instead of one, in 100 blades instead of a dozen, though my own hands touched fewer of them with each passing year." "And that did not trouble you?" Brandvor asked. "To see your name on work your hands had not finished?" "It troubled me at first," Halvar admitted. "It felt like losing something. It took me a long while to understand that I had not lost anything at all. I had simply stopped mistaking my hands for the only place my craft could live." "And if one of those 12 smiths had made a blade that failed in battle," Brandvor asked, "would that not have been your failure too, by your own name travelling with it?" "It would have grieved me," Halvar said honestly. "But I trained them carefully, and a craft passed on carefully rarely fails in ways that careless training would have failed first. I could not control every blade forever. I could only make certain the hands I released it to were worthy of carrying it forward. Brandvar sat with this through the rest of that long winter evening. The following spring, he allowed Sultan to finish a blade entirely on his own, presenting it to the hall under Sultan's own name, watching with some discomfort as the warriors praised work his own hands had not touched at all. He nearly stepped in twice during that first finishing, once when Sultan's hammer fell at an angle slightly different from his own habit, once when the water timing ran a few breaths longer than he himself would have allowed. Both times he caught himself, remembering Halvar's question about whose risk he was truly managing, and both times the blade came out true, regardless, tempered in a manner that was unmistakably Sultan's own, and no less sound for being different from Brandvar's. It was, he found, considerably harder than holding on had ever been. But within 2 years, Sultan had trained 2 apprentices of his own, and Brandvar's particular way of tempering steel, the precise angle, the timing of the water, lessons Brandvar had taught him patiently over years, had spread to blades carried by warriors who had never once met the old smith who first shaped that knowledge. A warrior returning from a distant campaign once brought a blade to Brandvar's own forge for repair, unaware it had been forged in his workshop at all. Sultan had moved on by then to lead a hall of his own further north. Brandvar recognized the temper instantly, the particular angle of the edge, the faint hammer pattern near the hilt that no one else struck quite that way. He repaired it carefully, said nothing of the recognition, and felt, working on a blade his own hands had never touched, something that felt very much like pride. "You are in every one of those blades," Halvar told him, visiting again years later, "even the ones your hands never touched." In Norse mythology, Odin's wisdom was never won through force or sole possession, but through a willingness to release something valuable in exchange for understanding that could then be shared. He sacrificed an eye at Mimir's well for wisdom, and hung from Yggdrasil for 9 days to receive the runes, knowledge he then carried back and distributed among gods and mortals alike, rather than hoarding it as a private source of his own singular power. 2 threads from this mythology speak to Brandvar's late discovery. The first is the figure of Mimir himself, whose severed head Odin consulted for counsel. Wisdom here is depicted as something passed between holders, never confined permanently to a single source, always moving outward to wherever it might be useful. The second is the dwarven smiths Brokkr and Sindri, whose finest works, including Mjolnir itself, were valued precisely because the craft was trusted to skilled hands beyond the gods' own, rather than the gods insisting on shaping every legendary object personally. Brandvar's early refusal to release a single finishing stroke to Sultan, this mythology would suggest, mistook personal completion for true mastery, when the deeper Norse understanding, embodied in Odin's own willingness to sacrifice and share rather than hoard, holds that wisdom and craft both grow stronger precisely when they are released into other capable hands. Perhaps you recognize Brandvar's habit in the way you redo a household task someone else has already finished, simply because their way differs slightly from your own. or in how reluctant you have felt to let a colleague present work you helped shape, needing your own name attached before you can fully release it. Perhaps it shows up in how tired you have grown from believing that everything meaningful in your life must pass through your own hands alone before it can be considered properly done. Notice how much lighter a task can feel once you trust another hand to finish it well. Notice it, too, in the recipe you insist on cooking yourself every holiday, declining help even when tired because some part of you has quietly decided the meal only counts if your own hands made it. Notice, too, what it might feel like tonight to release something you have been gripping tightly, the way Brandvor finally released the final stroke of the blade. You do not need to finish anything yourself right now. Simply let this moment be tended by something larger than your own effort alone, and let that same release carry you gently towards sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Tonight we began with the quiet kind of leadership that is barely noticed at all, the kind that shapes everything around it without ever needing to announce itself. And over these 13 chapters, we let that question open slowly from many different sides. We watched a general named Hezro learn that silence could carry further than his shout ever had. We sat with a headman who finally stopped signing his name to decisions his own village could make without him. We stood in a kitchen with a chef named Ostan, who learned to trust hands besides his own. We crossed the sea with a captain named Dorien, who finally surrendered the helm to rest. We sat in council with a queen regent named Avela, who discovered her absence taught more than her presence ever had. We watched a foreman named Itzal finally name the hands that had truly cut the stone. We listened to musicians play, unconducted, under Soren's quiet, trusting gaze. We knelt beside a midwife named Kalanfa, who finally let a birth proceed entirely on its own. We crossed dry country with a caravan leader named Mbeki, who finally trusted a scout's eyes besides his own. We sailed beside a navigator named Talay, who learned to explain rather than simply correct. We tracked country with a hunter named Bidjara, who finally walked behind rather than ahead. We tended hives beside a beekeeper named Yashek, who learned that care could look like leaving well alone. And we stood at a forge with a smith named Brandvor, who finally let another hand strike the final blow. We are not the loudest voice in the room, and we never needed to be. We are not the hand that must finish every task alone, and we never needed to be that either. We are not measured by how visibly we lead or manage or control the people and tasks around us. We are the quiet trust that lets another's instincts sharpen. We are the patience that reads what is already present before insisting on something new. We are the steady presence that does not need to announce itself to be real. This is the thesis this evening has circled from many directions, that we often believe influence requires visibility, credit, and control, while the deeper truth points elsewhere entirely. The surest mark of a wise guide is how little they need to be seen at all. The same is true of how we manage our own lives. Sometimes the wisest hand is the one that stops gripping the reins and trusts what was already capable of finding its own way. This is not a lesson learned once and then carried forever without effort. Like Branfor releasing the final stroke, like Bijara learning to walk behind, it asks to be practiced again and again, each time the old habit of gripping tighter quietly reasserts itself. That return is not failure. It is simply how a genuine teaching settles into a life, slowly, the way Itzel's hives finally settled into their own quiet, undisturbed rhythm. You do not need to remember everything you heard tonight. If one moment stayed with you, one phrase, one feeling, let that be enough. Wherever you are right now, you are welcome here, exactly as you are, with whatever you are carrying and whatever you are ready to set down. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night.